Talk about phosphorus, the background information here. This is, to my knowledge, the meeting for the general public. Do you have any questions? My name is Greg Kidd. I'm President Training Director of Northeast Water Wastewater Training Associates.
I'm Erica Kidd. I work with him also. This is a similar presentation to what we did for planning board members last week, but again, just geared a little bit more for public today.
We'll get started.
Yeah.
What is phosphorus? An element naturally in water, soil, and air. It's an essential element for life. It's part of photosynthesis. Plants need this. It's an element. We can't make it. It's critical to life's, essential to life, essential to our cells functioning. So it's not a bad thing. It's when it gets too much, we're going to look at that, it's a bad thing. Okay? We use this as an indicator of water quality and what can and is growing in the water. And this is certainly a picture of a water body that's been eutrophied. We have eutrophication. It's enhanced, it's aging, it's in the dying process really. There's a natural process water bodies go through, and this has been sped up through here. Phosphorus is found in fertilizers. You all know that. You know, you get your 10-10-10 or whatever you have there, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus. It's found in pesticides. A lot of people don't realize that. The organophosphates, the pesticides that we use a lot of. Detergents, found in wastewater, be it from septic systems or from the wastewater treatment plant discharges. Okay? Low amounts, absolutely critical for stuff to grow in water, for life to happen, but excessive amounts are a problem. Okay? So we were talking last week a little bit about the ordinances there, and one of the questions the gentleman up front asked, what do you think about the buffer between 27 and the pond? And again, looking at it, because I come down here, and of course when you drive by it 100 times, you don't see it, right? Paid attention tonight. That's a lot of mature trees there, isn't it? Mature trees take up this phosphorus, the roots stabilize the soil, and it keeps it from running in. We also discussed some last week, and in some communities they have strict ordinances on the fertilizers and applications of fertilizers within so many feet of the watershed or the water body you're trying to protect. And some communities do that. Some don't. Some have a complete ban on any phosphates or phosphorus in their detergent. Yes?
What would be an example of a, let's say, potential level of fertilizer allowed in, let's say, a 50-foot zone or 100-foot zone that break down their codes in that fashion?
We could look that up. I don't know off the
You
top of
mean
my
kind of
head.
like pounds per area,
Yeah.
something like that?
Yeah,
For load.
I would
For
assume
loading.
that there would be a spread rate that you regularly have for fertilizers like we all do on
Yeah.
farms and whatnot.
Yeah,
They would limit that to a certain amount
per
square
area.
foot or per acre
Yeah.
within a certain zone, 75 feet, 100 feet, 150 feet,
Yep.
I'm not sure. If you get two sources of water, Knickerbocker Lake and
Adams Pond.
but you also have situations where they also run into West Harbor Pond.
We think we talked about that a little bit last week, didn't we? Some on that, yes.
But specifically taking a look at that, if that's ever adopted as an ordinance or as a function of an ordinance, because you have a lot of camps right on the pond. I mean, you also have situations where you look at phosphorus from the standpoint of going in their septic system because of their location.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Function.
And that's where some of the communities that I've read about is they've got sandy soils. Depending on groundwater, they're also concerned about phosphorus moving through the groundwater into the receiving waters. And as far as the loading rate on the soils, the agronomic loading rate, I don't know, but we can certainly look that up and provide that.
It might be helpful from the standpoint of planning board that's starting to go and take a look at phosphorus rates going into the ponds. Another
Yep.
portion of the issue that's around here, at least I know on Knickerbocker Lake, is the soil type that I've dug up in my excavations at various places is usually marine clay.
Yes. So what happens to the wastewater in the leach field?
Right over the top.
Right over the top, yes. Not a lot of movement through that. Goes right through. So it's not only the loading rate for fertilizers. We can also dig up, and again, if this was helpful, this is kind of why we're doing this too, background on info, and more questions, we can look into this as far as what the loading rate may be coming out of septic systems, if that would help. Let me think about that. That's pretty much covered under your state though, isn't it? Or
Usually,
yeah.
in the state, but I
You
think
wanna
it's-
know.
I think it's just good to have planning boards
Gotcha.
taking a look at phosphorus trace to have that
Yeah.
information.
Yeah. I don't know about the studies up here, but I do know down south, they've done imaging. They fly over and they'll take the image and you can see the plumes of the algae bloom from the excess phosphorus runoff coming into their water bodies down there. Yeah. So there's quite a bit of information on that through National Environmental Clearinghouse. We can get some info on that. Okay. Phosphorus moves from land to water by rain and runoff. This is one of the big things, is controlling runoff and also land use development, as you don't strip all the topsoil down and leave it unprotected. That's why we have so much on erosion control now, because the phosphorus can be attached in those soil molecules and it just runs off right into the water. Okay? From wastewater too, both the septic systems, the on-site systems and municipal systems. And John Ziegler brought us in to talk about the big concern here is drinking water reservoirs. It is used by the microlife, and by the microlife we mean stuff that we need a microscope to see, or the algae, the small plants and stuff. Okay. This is just a little schematic here with phosphate rocks. Yeah, they mine it. We can strip mine it here. We have fertilizers put on the crops. We've got erosion going on. We've got animal waste. Last week, a person mentioned some horses and horse farms, which is always a concern when you have livestock near there, controlling the runoff from that. There's phosphates that are in the soil here attached. It's kind of a sticky substance, if you will. The molecule kind of sticks. So it likes to just hook up something and move along. Okay? And then when it gets into the receiving water, there's a cycle it goes through, and we're going to look at that cycle as we go along. So once it builds up too much, it just gets this internal cycle and keeps going round and round in there. Okay. It also, precipitation comes out of the rain. We wash this down. We've got the residential runoff. It's on our roads. Here's a septic system. I don't know the conditions by Knickerbocker Lake. I haven't been there, haven't inspected them, but years ago I was chief sanitary inspector for Port Warren District, and we inspected septic systems any septic system within 250 feet of high water. Sebago Lake was in our jurisdiction. And we knew when they were failing, because again, they're a little squishy there, and you kind of, seems like a bad day. And how did we prove it? What test did we use to prove they were failing? Really simple. We took a sample and we test for phosphorus. And we do a color change, and with a bright purple, we knew there's only way that much phosphorus could be coming is from a failing septic system.
You test the soil or you test?
We just tested the little water above it. Because you'd have breakthrough out of the bleaching fields. It would break out, break through, come up.
Yeah.
Soils get saturated, the water wasn't going down anymore. And compare that to normal runoff, normal water on the surface, very little color. Take a sample of that, it turned bright purple on you. Pretty inexpensive and easy to do. So what this is, one of the big concerns too, is excess nitrogen and phosphorus causes eutrophication, in other words, the enrichment of the lake, and it causes algae blooms. So the algae will take in the phosphorus. This is a real important nutrient, okay? Just like we take in calcium for our bones, they take in phosphorus for their cells to grow. And after they bloom, well, they've grown, it's like growing a garden, and they're going to die off, and what happens to them? They sink to the bottom. And when they sink to the bottom, they become food for the bacteria down in the bottom. And as they break it down, they use up the oxygen. And once there's no more oxygen down there, that phosphorus that's caught in the cells gets released. And then twice a year, we have what goes on up here? Turnover. And those nutrients come back up to the top. The algae say life is good, the temperature's great, sunlight's wonderful, and now we got plenty of phosphorus. And we keep cycling and cycling around like this. So the big concern is best management practices, land use practices that control this runoff so we prevent getting to this state.
And that cycle really only starts if you all of a sudden have an overload of phosphorus. There's natural amounts found in, lakes, ponds, especially drinking water supplies. But it's really once you have that excess that you'll start to have that cycle, and it turns itself over every year. And it's kind of hard to tell how long it's going to last for.
Why is this phosphorus control, so important? And for planning boards and comprehensive planners to get involved and work with the people on the watershed in the water districts is it negatively impacts water quality. And we talked about this last week, but for those of you who weren't here, you all heard about Lake Auburn last year? Lake trout got killed, that big blue-green algae bloom took place, excess phosphorus came in. It's a one-time thing as last year, we're not really sure why. We think it was excess rain brought it in and killed a lot of fish, and they're looking at over $400,000 right now into the study. Okay. So what's that going to do to the property values? It's going to knock them down, sure. And that what you have there from green is, property values on Sabatis Pond. Yeah, I mean, compared to other, almost 2,000 acre lakes or ponds, not so good, is it? Yeah, it certainly has an impact up there. Right?
And that was, their ordinance was revamped kind of in reaction to that, right? Is that correct? It kind of was
the
revamped
2001.
afterwards?
I assume it was,
Yeah, you've got yours, that's 2001, right?
I think so.
Because we
Yeah.
had, John had sent me that.
Right. Which again was after the fact. Okay? So it is essential for life. We have phosphorus in us. It helps our cells go. It helps our cells work. If we don't implement the proper controls, too much gets in there. We're going to have the growth of nuisance algae and bacteria. And bacteria, we talk about blue-green algae, also known as cyanobacteria. Okay. And there's a nice bunch of it right there, taking over. There's the cells right there. You can see the chlorophyll in there, cyanobacteria. We call them blue-green algae. And what's the problem with this particular algae or some of them? Toxins, you got it. These cells can build up and hold toxins. And they come to the water plant, and if the water plant hits them with chlorine to pre-chlorinate to get rid of them, those toxins are released. So they're really challenged for the drinking water systems once these blooms occur. A big challenge on these. Excess phosphorus, really difficult to remove. In fact, we usually don't remove it from the water systems. We chemically bind it in the sediments and hope it stays there. A gentleman last week mentioned Chickawaukee Lake up in Rockland there. They put alum, loaded it with aluminum sulfate, a metal to hold it, chemically bind up the phosphorus and have it stick on the bottom so it stops recycling.
It's either that, usually, or copper sulfate, I think is the other one. Right?
Copper sulfate to sink the algae down and have them sink to the bottom. Okay. At which time they will rob the bottom of what? Oxygen. And what happens to the fish? They die. And now you got a stinking mess on top of the water. How's that for property values? Not so good. How's that for drinking water? Taste? Not so good, right? Yeah. So once it gets there, it's really difficult to control or remove. Okay. Want to take this one?
Sure, yep. So just some more on the background of this algae we're talking about. Phosphorus is one of the limiting nutrients for it to grow and proliferate. So if there are normal or low amounts of phosphorus, you kind of don't have to worry about these noxious algal blooms. But if you all of a sudden have an overload coming in from a rain event or runoff, it can kind of kickstart these small organisms to grow. So phosphorus is a key nutrient for these things to take off. And as you said, phosphorus, it is found in fresh water, just in small amounts. It's not naturally there in high amounts. It cycles through, the air, the soil, the water. And because it is so rare, again, once there's an overload of it, you have a lot of growth in lakes and ponds, especially around here in summertime and kind of late summer into early fall. So that's just an example of what some of the algae you might have seen before on lakes and ponds around here looks like. It's that thick green matted stuff. Again, once you have an overload of nutrients, it can proliferate and develop like that. You might see it covering small ponds, but some of the Great Lakes have problems with algae blooms. I mean, it can grow on massive scales. I mean, depends on how much phosphorus is available. So it's definitely something to try and prevent phosphorus overloads rather than react to it after the fact, because it is difficult to remove. I said alum and copper sulfate. You really don't want to be dumping those things into your drinking water supply or any local water body. It's pretty nasty stuff.
Because if we were to put alum in, aluminum sulfate, we're making sulfuric acid in there. We're lowering the pH. We're acidifying the water bodies. If we put copper sulfate in, copper sulfate's a biocide, it kills living stuff. Your cold water fisheries, it destroys their gills. It doesn't allow the oxygen transfer. So both of those have severe negative impacts, or can. They really can.
So for measuring phosphorus, you had mentioned you can, when you're testing septic systems and septic tanks, leach fields, take a sample of a little bit of water that's on top of the soil there and hold it up to a color chart. This is for salt water, but it's just an example. And you can look for that color change. And that's a really quick and easy way to see, is there a normal amount? Is there too much? And that's what you can use for water samples from lakes and streams around here too. So phosphorus is usually measured in parts per billion, and moderately productive lakes, which is probably what's most common around here, have 10 to 20 parts per billion. So that's a tiny amount. And it's really, it's pretty easy to get that amount too high. It can take just like a flash rain event, runoff like we said. So you want to stay between that 10 and 20 parts per billion. Highly productive lakes have 20 and over, and the less productive lakes have under 10.
Do we know what ours is right now?
Yeah, we're compiling that information. We've been measuring both Knickerbocker and Adams Pond for over the last 10 years. And
So we know what the daily cycle amount is, what the period of time through the year it's been the worst, better in the summer, better in the winter than it is in the summer.
I can give you, no, not really. I can give you sampling during the summertime.
But you don't have a 365 day, so we know when the height of it is.
Not for phosphorus.
No, and I will tell you that we were asked last week, and we're working with John to pull together a report for the phosphorus and the chlorophyll A over the last 10 years, pull this data together and get it to the planning board and the Dan and the like. So people who have interest in that will share the data with you. But you mentioned, bring up something about 365. A lot of times here in the north, we assume something's happening in the wintertime, because who knows? The lake's covered with ice, right? A few years ago, I got an AquaView fishing camera. I'd never seen anything below the ice before, except, when I cover up like this and clear water, right? So I got my camera out and I'm looking, and I started noticing these great big, they look like cotton balls of algae. And they're still green in March, after all that snow and ice. And in theory, every book we've ever read says what's going to happen to a green plant without sunlight? It's going to die, right? You're a botanist, yeah? No photosynthesis, they die off, right?
Get some sunlight.
Somehow, sunlight is making it through the layer of snow, the layer of ice, and these things are kind of limey green, bright green cotton balls. And they stink. And they found over sand. So I'm talking to the people from the Volunteer Lakes Association here in Maine, and they asked me, well, have you seen an increase in them? I said, how would I know? We've never looked before, have we? Because who was out looking for algae growing in the wintertime? So a lot of this stuff we measure during open water, but we really don't and haven't been looking in the wintertime. Great point, but we just haven't been looking in the wintertime. Either because of technology or just how we're gonna do it in the wintertime, you know? So by using this camera, I found that seem to be about that big around. It's all little algae hooked together. I had to key them out and they're metaphytons. But
But we don't know if that was a natural occurrence for that type of year.
You got it.
Go by.
You got it. Where was our baseline?
Certainly.
What John has is 10 years of measurements as we can see through, and in the summertime, and as we'll talk a little more, when these algae blooms, certain things come into play, and they're usually warmer, late summer. Yes, yeah. So,
But wouldn't you have, in the evolution of a pond or anything else, you would have that, the way it's gonna grow? I mean, every pond
yes,
starts out, and then eventually there's a dying cycle for it.
yes it is.
You know, so what we're trying to do is actually prolong the dying cycle of it.
We're trying to prevent humans from killing that.
Right.
You got it.
Yeah, making it happen
Eventually,
early.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because unproductive lakes, we call them unproductive as far as all the growth goes, but we call those oligotrophic lakes. Those are our cold water trout ponds. They're very nutrient limited, very little parts per billion of phosphorus, but they support our cold water fisheries. So we call those oligotrophics, like Sebago Lake, Rangeley Lake, those type of lakes. Crystal clear water, see forever in them. Okay?
They're deeper lake,
Those are
A
deeper
lot of
lakes.
glacial lakes.
over 18 feet.
Yeah. Then we get to the moderately productive, and these are mesotrophics. These are probably like Adams Pond, well, what I remember the data, your phosphorus is in there.
Yeah, generally speaking, Adams Pond's in the 10 to 20 ppb, and Knickerbocker is routinely over 20.
Okay, and so this is, if we were to take a water body over the time, it's gonna start like this, way down the bottom, then this is the next natural cycle, exactly what you said, and then highly productive or eutrophication or eutrophic lakes are over 20 parts per billion, and we use phosphorus as one of the numbers to key us in on when we're getting to that. And you're right, that is a natural cycle, but when we add detergents and fertilizers,
Speed processing.
we sure have, yes. Yep. You want to talk about chlorophyll?
So another indicator for how productive a lake is going to be is the chlorophyll A levels, and I believe you also have chlorophyll A data for Adams and Knickerbocker. So you can use it as an indicator for what's growing in the different water bodies. Chlorophyll A is found in all green plants. You can use it as a measure of the amount of algae that's present. And again, it's kind of indicative of the productivity that's going on in a lake.
So this directly connects to the phosphorus level. The more phosphorus level, the more chlorophyll A there should be. And one of the reasons why we use chlorophyll A is it's for the phytoplankton, the plant plankton versus the zooplankton, the animal plankton. And that's what our concern here is. Right? So it's really a great indicator of lake productivity. And again, you've got 10 years of data on that.
Since 2000,
Yeah.
since over time.
Yeah. Okay.
So we were talking about phosphorus levels and how you measure that. It's parts per billion. Chlorophyll A, it's an even smaller amount of, it's micrograms per liter. So it's, sorry, parts per billion? Yeah. So it's still, a tiny, tiny amount. And if you have low amounts of chlorophyll A, you probably aren't having that many algal blooms. It's just there's not a lot of green productivity going on.
So like that previous slide, we're looking at, as it says in your handout there, chlorophyll A at levels of less than 2 parts per billion or micrograms per liter. Not much chlorophyll in those cells. Okay?
And for the moderate levels, you have between 2 and 8 micrograms per liter. So still not a lot, but you'll have some more algal growth. And these usually aren't, these levels of chlorophyll A usually don't support blue-green algae, the cyanobacteria, the really noxious algal blooms. But they do promote algal growth throughout the summer and usually in the late summer. And for the highly productive lakes, you'll have higher amounts of chlorophyll A, just like you do for phosphorus, and it'll be over 8 micrograms per liter. And this is often a cause for algal blooms that you'll see throughout the summer months, throughout the hot months. It can often be cyclical, and these chlorophyll A above 8 micrograms per liter usually promotes blue-green algae or cyanobacterial growth.
So if we see chlorophyll A above 8, we feel pretty good we're heading towards noxious algae, blue-green algae blooms. Typically, they occur in late summer. August into September, that's when the bloom occurred in Lake Auburn last year. I just got an email this week from the state of New Hampshire DES. They had a meeting this Wednesday. They've already got it in one of the, it's not a drinking water supply, but it's got a public beach on it, and it's got a lot of waterfront property on it. Already they've started this year with blue-green algae, cyanobacterial bloom. I'm gonna assume.
What makes something happen earlier in the year than late in the summer, besides, the chlorophyll A and the phosphorus coming up, but what kind of environments do we see early in the year to make something happen?
I think it was
Just water
probably
runoff, or is it rain?
Well, this spring.
temperatures too.
Temperature is biggie.
Temperature?
This past weekend was extremely
Temperature is a
Warm.
biggie.
Some.
Sun, but temperature too drives these things. And we didn't have a lot of runoff this spring compared to normal. At least the work I've done.
And we had
Yeah,
and we had a cold May.
Really cold.
Yeah, on the coast. You go inland, I've been doing a lot of work in central New Hampshire. The Merrimack River and Pemigewasset, up until last week, looked like summer flows, not springtime flows. Very warm. Sunlight, warmer temperature, combination of this, and probably I'm going to assume the excess nutrients, because I got a sense of, I fished this particular spot, and I'm assuming, I can't prove it, but I'm assuming there's failing septic systems, and the people have cut the trees down and put in lawns, and they have a green lawn. What do? They fertilize. So we measure chlorophyll A's. If it's high, we're going to pretty much be guaranteed for frequent and persistent algae blooms, because basically we're measuring that chlorophyll A that's in the algae. And then late summer, we typically get the blue-green algae. They take off then. But it's temperature, sunlight. So again, back to what you'd mentioned, eutrophication. Most of this, yeah, we have natural cycles, but I'll be honest with you, look at the lakes and ponds here, and it's human caused, isn't it? It is. Sabatis Pond, Chippewa, China Lake, Lake Auburn now. That's all caused by humans. This is not a natural cycle. We've sped it up. We have. Okay. Agriculture runoff, fertilizers, pesticides, and urban runoff enters the water. If you start studying stormwater and looking at the runoffs there, that first flush is loaded with stuff. Fortunately here, you've got a nice vegetative buffer between 27 and Adams Pond. I don't know what the vegetative buffer is at Knickerbocker Lake. Okay.
Varies.
It varies. But that is one of the keys, is to let the vegetation capture this. Or put in what? If somebody's going to develop, what could you make them put in to capture this?
Best management practices.
What?
Settling pools?
Sediment ponds, you got it. Filtration ponds, sedimentation basins, you got to capture that there, let it, make a blanket up top, filter this, capture the phosphorus, and let the clean water move through.
Because I've seen a lot of them, like, across that 27, they run like ditches down across those places, made it so it would catch.
So it would catch,
Then
yeah.
I've seen a lot of them remove their trees and put in sharp brush.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know why, but they went, bushes was better than trees.
Because sometimes when they put all that water on them, some trees don't like wet feet, and some shrubs will take wet feet better. And so the shrubs, you can get them wet, soak them in there, and get their feet wet, if you will, and they'll keep growing. Some of the trees, you get their feet wet, you don't allow the oxygen to transfer, and actually the trees will die off. And you see that sometimes when beavers get into a swamp, right, or they make it. Next thing you know, your big oaks are dying off, and
Yeah, and then
all the
put
little-
roots up and everything else.
right.
yes, and all the little shrubs are coming up in their place, the winterberries and stuff. So Fertilizers, pesticides, we'll get you some information on those loadings, because I know communities have looked at this, what makes sense. So you want to talk about this slide?
Sure. So this is what we've kind of been working up to is how these lakes, once they have an excess amount of phosphorus coming in, and often nitrogen is tied to it, but how they become eutrophic and start producing algae blooms. That can happen in a number of ways. As we said, phosphorus can enter the system. And so with the sunlight and warm temperatures and not a lot of movement in the water, those are some key factors for algae to grow. So you think of warm temperatures and sunlight, that's why it's so common in summertime, especially late summer. And in smaller lakes and ponds, there's not a lot of water movement necessarily. So if it's just kind of sitting there stagnant, heating up, getting warmer, that's perfect conditions for algae to grow. And add a little bit of phosphorus and that can just jumpstart the whole thing. So the algae will grow on the surface of the water. You can see that, bright green kind of pea soup color start to develop, but it's not always, a noxious algae that develops. It's not always harmful to us. Sometimes it is just, plant life growing and in small amounts, that's okay. But what we're going to get into is cyanobacteria, the blue-green algae, and that actually has negative health effects for humans and wildlife. So that will start to develop on the surface of the water. Towards the end of the summer, at the end of its life cycle, it will die off, drop down, decay, and a lot of the toxins that are in cyanobacteria can be released then. And while they're decaying on the bottom there, you're using up oxygen. If your fish and other wildlife around there that are living in the water, if it deprives them of oxygen, they will then die off, and that can just lead to a whole host of problems. Bad sights, bad smells. And with the case of Lake Auburn, they're not sure if that's going to be a cyclical thing, if that's going to happen again this year. That's really difficult to predict. So the idea is to prevent it as best as you can in the first place.
With a pond like such as ours up here, why wouldn't couldn't you treat it like an aquarium type thing and have a large aeration right up through the middle of it with this new plastic pipe that they got? Just think about it, you ran a big piece of plastic pipe up through holes in it and aerated it. Wouldn't you slow that process down?
You certainly could. In fact, if you drive by the campground coming up here, they've got their water fountain going already. Just last week at White's Pond in downtown Concord, all the goldfish went belly up and everybody's in a panic. Well, they've been in there for years. In that case, it's probably ammonia buildup. They do a little of air, but not enough. But the cost of aerating is through the roof. The electrical cost to put air in the water. And the other thing that happens with those pipes, because we use them in wastewater, in lagoons. We build a man-made pond and put the wastewater and we aerate it. There's a lot of that, and we don't quite understand the water chemistry why, but it makes like hard calcium deposits in those diffusers and in the plastic, and then we end up trying to clean those with acid, which is the acid we use is extremely dangerous. In some cases, that's exactly what they do, but the cost of doing that is huge. Yeah. They did that in Mashpee, Mass. Put an aerator in one of their lagoons to break up the mats of the blue-green algae. They did. Yeah. So it can be done, but huge money. They're doing that in Gulf Island Pond on the Androscoggin River.
So I thought it'd be a pretty neat idea,
Yep.
1.5 mile of that stuff and have some way of just pumping air to it. There's some process that you guys use there.
And it would be a big blower.
Yeah.
Yeah. They spend over $1 million a year pumping air into Gulf Island Pond on the Androscoggin River above Lewiston, Auburn.
You don't even make windmills with it,
Because they do make a solar one that mixes, yes, but that's, I couldn't see Adams Swan being covered with them, except worst case scenario. But they do have them run off solar energy too. So, yeah. So the effects of this: increases algae growth. The algae uses up the oxygen. Everybody thinks plants give off oxygen. They absolutely do, but in the nighttime, they take up oxygen to stay alive. And they use it up, and if they use up too much, we get the fish kills. And now you have the property owners on Knickerbocker Lake, or you said West Harbor, or and you got a fish kill, and what happens to the property values? They go down. They sink like a rock. They do.
And in this picture, it's kind of a good example. You see the bright green grass, so it's probably well fertilized. Probably got some pesticides on it, and then right next to it, you got a pile of dead fish.
Yeah. Okay. You want to talk about this?
Sure. So if you have algae developing and you have too much phosphorus, a lot of times it can affect the water quality, of course. And you can have the algae developing on the top, but sometimes it even turns the water green, yellow, brown. So if you're a homeowner and you live right next to, you have waterfront property, that can be pretty nasty stuff to be around. So that's one of the ways that can decrease the value of either a river or a lake. And, with that goes all the recreational value of it, aesthetic value of it, not only for homeowners, but, in kind of public access areas too. And the big thing is when you have blue-green algae develop, there's definitely health effects that go along with that we're going to talk about. And that's the case in, public ponds, lakes, and streams, but especially in your drinking water, that can be really problematic. I'm sure John could speak to that, but it just becomes difficult to remove it, to make sure you're getting rid of all those health issues associated with the algae development. So we have, what do we have here? So with the increased phosphorus, you get the blue-green algae growth, and these are the ones that produce toxins. There's a whole list of toxins that are associated with these algae, and it's when they break down, usually when they die off in late summer, or if they're treated in a certain way. I think you said chlorine, that can promote their breakdown, and that's when these toxins are let out. There's some that affect the nervous system, some that affect your liver, intestinal system. So it's pretty nasty stuff, and they can be either ingested through drinking the water or inhaled. So there's some serious health hazards, and it's not just for us, it's for wildlife too. Pets, you don't want anyone or anything exposed to these when they break down. So the idea is to not even have these develop on your lakes and ponds, especially your drinking water. And we talked a little bit before, what are the ideal conditions for these things to grow? Warm water, warm temperatures, sunlight, not a lot of movement in the water, not a lot of turning over. And along with phosphorus, nitrogen kind of goes hand in hand with promoting the growth of these. So if you don't have a lot of flow, high temps, these things can really take off.
This is another key thing, especially from the drinking water standpoint, protecting that resource, is these hazardous algae blooms, the cyanobacteria, are on EPA's drinking water contaminants list. 20 years ago, they weren't. Okay, we're understanding these. They're blooming more. Why? I'm not sure. The scientists are studying this. Is it climate change? Are we having better growing seasons? We do know that nutrients are a key limiting factor for them. They've always been here. They're some of the oldest living things on the planet. Okay, any of you grow a garden?
Yeah.
You plant peas or green beans?
Yeah.
Yes, and you pull up your green bean plants, and what do you see all over the roots?
I haven't.
Never done
Pay
that?
attention to it.
Nodules.
Nodules are bacteria that can fix nitrogen. Very few bacteria and very few things can take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and use it. They do that, soybeans do. And blue-green algae can also do that. So they were able to take nitrogen out of the air. So when we talk about nutrients and limiting factors, they can do that, then phosphorus becomes our key. So phosphorus is our key. Restrict recreational use. Most of the places when they have cyanobacteria blooms, it is banned. You don't go in the water, you don't go near the water, you don't take your dogs for a walk. Because your dog goes in the water, comes out, shakes off, licks its fur, and next thing you know, the dog's going into convulsions from the neurotoxins. And absolutely reduces property values when you have these noxious blooms. Okay? So they'll take in this excess, they'll grow, they'll sink to the bottom, they'll use up, the oxygen gets used up, the cells release the phosphorus, then we have turnover and brings it all back up to them again. Fantastic. Or some of them overwinter and they got little they store phosphorus in their cells. Kind of neat to look at too.
So one of the examples of where this happened is Willen Pond in New Hampshire. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. Just outside Dover. And there was a development that went right along the shoreline of Willen Pond. It was a big clear-cut area. I think Staples went in there. And it was up the banking a little bit, and as soon after that was put in, a lot of algae growth started to develop on the pond, and it was cyanobacteria. So the area that was frequently used for recreational purposes, family walks, pets, fishing, was completely shut down to the public. And in this picture, there's some of the biologists at UNH have been studying it. Obviously not when these blooms are in full effect, because it is restricted for any human access, but they've studied it and looking at the toxins that are being produced by these bacteria, and they found some of the liver toxins and neurological toxins were present. And this has been going on, this was in 2006, this picture, so it's been an ongoing problem, and this is a relatively small pond, but again, it was a recreational area that's now inaccessible.
This was also backup water supply for the city of Dover. So you could fish it, they had beautiful trails around it, but you couldn't go swimming in it and stuff. Recreation, canoes, everything. And in this development, we've talked about runoff, and we oftentimes think of surface runoff. What this was a pond with no natural outlet, so the water left through the ground. When they put the development in, they got the runoff from that, and they put sewer in, which changed the soil characteristics. Kind of like digging up the blue marine clay, and you put it back, it's not going to be the same, is it? And so what happened was the water didn't move out of the system, it backed way up into the forest, killed the plants, the vegetation. When those die, they're stored phosphorus and nitrogen, and those get released, and who got to eat it first? Blue-green algae. They outcompete. And this spring-fed pond, I use my camera fishing there 45 feet deep, and you can see the fish turning their nose up at your bait. But you can watch it. Crystal clear, it's not that way anymore. And what they're doing now is they're trying to pump. The city has come in and put a pump station in, and they try to pump about 300 gallons a minute during high flow periods to keep it from backing up again, to try to control this. The cost of a pump station plus pump 300 gallons per minute, that's a lot of kilowatt hours. I just was talking to Public Works Director on this. We mentioned this last week. I saw him last Wednesday after this session. So, good dealing with it. Lake Auburn. You want to take this?
Sure. So most of you are familiar with what happened in Lake Auburn last year. We did talk about this last week, but it's kind of a perfect example of what you don't want to happen here. It becomes a very expensive problem to fix, and as biologists were looking into it, they're still not sure what caused this overwhelming amount of phosphorus to get into their water system. It's really hard to pinpoint something like that. I mean, in some cases you might say, okay, there was a high rain event, or, it was coming from this development, but usually it's a combination of things, so it's really hard to pinpoint just one. And they had algae develop, and I said earlier, they're not sure if this was just a one-time thing or if it's going to continue again. With that big of an event with algae growing, the chances of it happening again are pretty good, especially if they haven't removed all that excess phosphorus that got into the lake. And I think you mentioned that this has already cost Auburn $400,000, and they have to continue to monitor it, so that's an ongoing cost. And where that tab's picked up, whether it's taxpayers or some state money, I'm sure it becomes a really expensive problem to try and fix. And that's one of the most recent reports of it, so that's kind of a culmination of what they've paid out already.
That's what I was going to say. This is 5/4/13 this year.
A month ago, yeah.
$400,000 on the problem. Initially, it was a couple hundred, $250,000. They keyed it to 2 major algae species, both blue-greens, if I remember the report correctly. And they're going to spend $150,000 to monitor this summer.
At
And I'm
least.
sure it'll be next summer too. So this is Auburn Water District. Who's gonna pay for this?
Everybody in the district.
Yeah, the ratepayers. People getting the water, they may get some grants to study this, but the bottom line is, this is the responsibility of the water district. This is their watershed. This is their drinking water supply.
Did they have a prior monitoring program
Oh, yeah.
in existence?
Yep.
And didn't they see it ramp up, I would thought, or something, if it was an ongoing one, or what?
They've, Auburn is kind of special. They're one of very few districts in the country that have what's called a filtration waiver. They don't have to filter the water like we do. They just have to disinfect it. And part of that is they have to have a pretty aggressive monitoring plan. They have a fully accredited lab. They buy land because keeping the water quality clean is very important to them to keep that waiver. What they're looking at right now, that $400,000 is a drop in the bucket
I was
because
just-
if the water quality gets bad enough where they lose their waiver, they're looking at about a $40 to $60 million bill to put a treatment plant in for Lewiston and Auburn, and that's real money then. That's,
But what I can't tell you is, I haven't read in the study that they saw this ramp up. This seemed to
This came
happen
out of nowhere.
like this. And that's the problem with amount of phosphorus, because every water body's got a little different chemistry to it and flow patterns to it, is what we call in our business, once you hit the tipping point, bam, you're there. It's like flicking a switch. You're fine, beautiful, and next thing you know, the light switch turns on and these things take off. And it's pretty hard to predict. We have ranges, like you saw on the phosphorus, 10 to 20 micrograms parts per billion. Over 20, we know we're there. But 10 to 20, that's a pretty good range when we're talking about. So that's one of the big challenges, is to try to predict when you hit that tipping point, if you will.
Kind of jumping back a little bit to chlorophyll A levels, I hadn't heard what we're looking at between Adams Pond and Knickerbocker as far as it goes.
I can't tell you off the top of my head, but we're also compiling those numbers as well.
And again, we talked to John last week after our meeting and asked, we'll pull those numbers together and absolutely get them to you on the planning board, so you know those.
Is it a DEP or EPA regulation, or what has to, is a good number? I mean, they must have a recommended amount, and if we exceed it, or we're under it, or,
I don't, not that I'm looking at you, but I don't know of anything that I've read. We have, like, we know on different water sources, we'll see if it has chlorophyll A. There might be groundwater on the influence of surface water, but as far as numbers, I don't, and I'm just going through here quick.
As far as,
The amount of chlorophyll A from EPA on this.
as being a regulated factor?
Yeah.
No,
No.
I don't believe so.
The numbers we have up here are generally accepted standards for those micrograms per liter.
but isn't there a formula that you can figure out what that is in a pond, based on the load?
Not that I know of.
I read somewhere where you could take the amount of runoff versus the days that it's at certain rates, fish oxygen levels, the whole works. There's a formula that will figure out the size of that pond that determines what that parts per billion should be for that area of the water body.
I'm sure there's a calculation just from runoff on that. Sorry, I understand what you're asking. The problem is I'm going to sound kind of cynical, but that's a paper formula. There are oftentimes so many variables when we start looking at this. So we can use those runoff rates as a ballpark, as a starting point, yes, sir. But then we have an exceptionally dry summer, exceptionally wet summer. We have cooler water, we have warmer summers, and that changes. Yeah. So here in Lake Auburn, they're measuring the dissolved oxygen temperature. They're looking at this, trying to figure out what's going on, do some of those monitorings there. So the effects of too much phosphorus, we've got the algal blooms. They lower the quality of drinking water, which means that in the case of drinking water systems, it's more work for them to bring that water quality back up. In the case of like Auburn Water District, they're on a filtration waiver, just like Portland Water District is, if they have to filter, now all of a sudden, as John said, the filter plant is huge money, huge money. It's gonna affect the quantity and quality and chemicals they use to treat drinking water and the filtration process. It certainly affects the property values near the water. You get noxious algae blooms, people don't wanna live there. They'll move away or lower the property rates. It's certainly a health hazard to the property owners. The cyanobacteria give off different toxins, hepatotoxins, neurotoxins, irritants, and costs incurred by taxpayers to remedy the problem. Eventually, that's where it comes back to, is somebody's gonna pay to fix it, aren't they? So preventing this phosphorus overload, we limit development near the watershed, development and farming. We try to do best management practices, control the use of phosphorus fertilizers, pesticides, and detergents. Because when we talk about all this other stuff, we talk about this as being non-point sources. We can't point out a pipe and say it's coming in from here. So this is what we talk about, non-point sources. Okay? So the phosphorus ordinance, best management practices, we'll look at this, the forestry practices, what the cropland practices are, animals, livestock, etc., so forth. So for properties on the waterfront or with access, connected relationship, good water quality, high property values, yes? You ever been down Lake Winnipesaukee? I grew up on that lake. Beautiful lake. Back in the late 60s, early 70s, the cabin cruisers were dumping holding tanks in the lake. People had cesspits. What happened to the water quality in that lake? It was going down, it was. They've come up with land use regulations around the area. They've sewered a lot of it. And I was just down there yesterday and read a local rag. Some of the property on Governor's Island in Guilford, $10 million, one of them. The other was 6.8. Growing up, yeah, they were expensive, but they weren't $10 million. The water quality on the lake, because of combination of best management practice, sewering there, controlling the runoff, it has really come back tremendously. We've stopped the aging process. We were heading to make it an old lake pretty quick. So this affects water quality, therefore property values. It's important. It's also important to protect the quality of the drinking water. You want to talk a little bit about this?
So this background information, obviously, it's all, in preparation for looking at the ordinance that's in existence right now for Boothbay region. It's in place to benefit the public, not to be a hindrance, but as we've discussed with Dan and John, some of the wording of it is pretty restrictive. There, 500-foot buffer that might be, in the works to be adjusted. But it's ultimately there for the benefit of protecting the quality of the water that's in Adams Pond and Knickerbocker, especially because those are your drinking water sources. So you really want to maintain the quality with those. So the idea is to look at the ordinance that's there and just update it as needed with best management practices. What are those best practices? Does that mean that the wording can be less restrictive for, homeowners and people in town? Maybe. So it's definitely something to look at and to look at updates that can be put into it. And so some of our goals that we've discussed, we're moving towards performance-based management with the ordinance. And we talked a little bit about the infiltration method. You can probably speak more to the technical
retaining
part
ponds,
of it.
stopping the
Right.
direct runoff, capturing it there. One of the things, again, we mentioned last week, if you're revising the ordinance, look at those infiltration ponds to capture the runoff, is include the required maintenance of those. Because you drive around New England and you see them getting full, and once they get full, it's going to run out and go over the top of those. That's one of the things that I've seen in my travels around New England. It seems to be missing. And we've had that discussion in other states and other meetings. Update the reference DEP and DES regulations, tie into those, include best management practices for land use. And I sent Erica an article, just perfect. Went along with what we're talking about. They talk about the fish kills in New Hampshire. And then the blue-green algae bloom all happened this past week. Okay? Fish and wildlife biologist wrote an article last Thursday all about best management practices. Keep mature forests. Don't scrape everything down and put a lawn and fertilize the heck out of it next to the water. Reduce the amount of pesticides going in. Because a lot of those pesticides are organophosphates. Phosphate is part of those pesticides. We use them for insects because it screws up their neurological system and they don't function. Okay? Control direct runoff, or don't make direct runoff. Don't go in and now put something in that's going to put a direct runoff into, put a filtration basin in. That's what they were talking about.
We still have that issue on Mickawaка Lake, I assume, and water coming off the side of the ledges down through on the drainage.
Yeah.
Nothing's really been done about that at this point.
So,
Pretty direct question on the standpoint that, yeah, I know those discussions occurred over the course of the last, unfortunately for you guys, maybe about 30 years. So one of those things where I don't see a lot happening from the standpoint of runoff.
And to speak to that, we really, the way the ordinance is written right now, there isn't much for us to act on. So what you're saying is exactly right. This would be a fundamental change in that regard. Be
So-
very helpful.
So, we're told that the objectives of revising the ordinance is writing specific best management plans to prevent this from occurring. Is make it more preventative, make it science-based, revised methods to outline infiltration. How are we going to do that? Can we put in catch basin, the infiltration basin, keep the runoff from going in? John has one right at the water plant up back there, behind the impervious, two of them. Okay.
And with rewriting or adding to the ordinance, of course, it would include maintenance, like you said. That's a big part of it. You said you had seen a couple of these basins along 127, is that right? So it'd be
Different areas.
different areas.
Yeah.
So a big part of that is maintaining those because, you know, they
I
can
just
fill
thought,
in.
Like 27 up here, okay? We're a tourist management community, okay? People want to see the water, okay?
Mhm.
Let's say that a group got together and says, geez, you know, that Auburn Pond is beautiful, but the trees, we can't see through them. If there was a swap off for a low-lying bush that somebody could drive by and see, say like junipers or something like that would do the same effect that the trees are doing, you're enhancing the beauty of the area of the region. You know, it's kind of got to be a give and take situation. If you're going to ask a person to pay thousands of dollars for a piece of property on the water, they want that view. We've got to come up with a plan so they can see it. You know, we've got to give them, like you say, that the water buffer zone area where it can be bushy, okay, back 50 feet from the water, you can cut it down, but you're going to have briar bushes, raspberry bushes, or whatever type of bush will ever take and do the same thing.
And that can be really effective is if you replace the, you know, not an absolute amount of vegetation that you remove, but say you're removing this much vegetation, can you replace that in different forms? You know, that can be...
We've got people around here that are scared to death to cut a tree limb
Right,
because they're afraid they're going to turn around and get fined.
right.
But
Well,
they
in
won't do
addition
that.
to your local ordinances, you have the state main shoreline protection zone, which is pretty strict on what they can do.
What I'm saying is those guys need to change too. It just isn't these guys here. It's, if we want people to come and pay the $10 million for it, we're gonna have to turn around and make
Yeah, there's
it
going to be ways that you
a
can
workable situation.
work
on both
together.
sides of the fence.
And what we were we're led to understand is that one of the goals is also replace the new knots with guidelines for what to do.
Right.
And I think a lot of things is like some of the things that I deal with on some of these ponds and stuff. It's one thing to write the ordinance for somebody to do something, but it's another thing to be able to provide funding for them to do that. And you can write all those rules and regulations and upgrade them, everything, but if the person doesn't have $1 to be able to enhance their property to bring that up to the code and stuff, it makes it very hard for some of these people. These stuff have been in the family for a long period of time.
Sure.
They're only using it a few times, you know. And I know where John's coming on your
Well-
individual basis of what you have problems.
Yeah, when you have like old cesspits, not septic system, not on-site, there's, there's plenty of those around by water bodies. And the little cesspits, they never really worked, they never failed because the water would just move through them, there was no leach field, right? But people, as you said, didn't load them the way they can now. And you've seen that with seasonal conversions, haven't you? And once you get to the seasonal conversions and they add more bathrooms, some old camps didn't even have shower, your bird bath. And now you're showering and you're showering a lot and all that extra soap. And then they put the washing machine in and the extra soap goes in with those detergents. So it's absolutely, there were people that will not ever cause a problem because of the loading rates. But as they change over and they want to use their property more and more and higher use, there's cost associated with that because of the loadings that they put on the system too. And our understanding is the objectives of revising this ordinance is to get to more what to do versus boom, you can't do anything here. So keeping in mind also that people have value, their property is valuable. Absolutely. And if there's some swap on vegetations for this vegetation, as long as it meets the state shoreline zoning, there's effective vegetation, there's some that isn't. Absolutely. So really, benefits of revising always cost reduced with preventative action versus responsive action. I think that's got to be a key thing here for the drinking water supply. We want preventative action versus going into responsive action. And if we provide the public the guidance on this through the ordinances, what you can do, this is why, and the importance of it, I think you're a step ahead.
And it's usually much less expensive to do the prevention than it is to pay out in response.
And so the key here we wanted to talk is, we were asked to talk about the importance of phosphorus. As you decide to move forward with revising your ordinances and your best management practices, it's absolutely critical here to provide us good water quality. It is. Be it recreation, for recreating, or for drinking water supplies. It really is. And even in salt water, we mentioned a little bit last week about the nutrients going in salt water and the red tide, the red algae, those blooms. And all we know is that there's a whole bunch of them sitting up in the sediments waiting for the right year again, and they'll bloom again. And you asked a great question, why now? But just think about red tide. Some years were right from June through, other years we got this little bitty window. They think a lot of that has to do with currents and specifically temperature, which of course is sunlight driven. So, any further questions for us?
We look at going from a restrictive ordinance that's primarily with the types of business and the setback requirements to something with the best management practices. Am I correct in assuming that these best management practices have to apply further out than, say, our 500-foot setback to where the water flows in, or do we just apply it to one particular area? Or?
Great question. When you read a little background, when I read a little background on what happened in Lake Auburn, they seem to think those nutrients came in much further up the watershed than what they initially expected to happen because of excessive rains that year. Portland Water District, their watershed protection goes all the way up to Bethel. Songo Pond is where it starts. You go all the way to Bethel and come down. They work with each community and they try to control, and they have warning signs, this is our watershed. So,
do we have maps, John, showing what our watershed is?
Yes. And you do have your source water action plan that talks about some of that also. I mean, just driving in here and looking again, driving 100 times, but now looking again because of this, you just see some of the runoffs coming by some of the properties coming in. Yeah, if you just don't look at those and you say an arbitrary 500 feet, you may be missing a major source. You may be missing a major
Yeah,
source.
but the goal too is not, to get right back to it, is the way the ordinance is currently written, it's restricted to the point of absurdity. And we're trying to get away from and that was never the intent of the town or the water district, it just happened.
Right.
And the point is to get this so that this is more activities can happen. And there's greater flexibility for landowners, but it's just performance. Make sure that it's done in such a way that it's not gonna hurt the water supply. And I think that's the goal, is it not?
So in some cases, they may be, for some landowners, a little more restrictive, right? Going back a little
But
further.
some that they're gonna.
And some less than.
Less than, yeah.
We're just in the infancy
Right.
stage now of looking at water and sewage running further down the corridor.
Yeah.
And I assume that just looking at the restrictions that apply to some of the properties along the corridor right now could be lifted or greatly reduced with water and sewerage, along with best management practices. So, but again, this is just at a infancy stage right now for planning.
Right, and that's why John asked us to come in and talk about the importance of controlling phosphorus, one of the
Yeah.
key limiting nutrients in protecting the watersheds, be it both
But
fresh and
this is
salty.
also, this is also a good argument for further justifying the benefits to the entire community to do water and sewage down that corridor.
Yeah, but then, am I still on the camera? But then, it's absolutely key that you have some land use planning on lot size to go along with that. Because sometimes you're very limited with development because you've got ledge, bad soils, you can't put the on-site systems in. Once you put the sewer in, those spaces you could have never developed before now can
Now
maybe
become
be
developed.
developed, yes, yes.
Well, we look at just the campground up there, if you can imagine what his leaching field looks
Yeah.
like.
Yes.
There's a massive amount of new sites that he'd put in if he was able to connect to water and sewage.
Yes, yes.
So again, it would benefit John as far as water, it would also benefit the community as far as income coming in.
It also could make it so his season could be longer.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
So he
true.
he may be able to turn some of the ones up on 27 to longer sites that people will even stay, all winter. If he should be able to.
And I will tell you, in a number of communities, is there are now, because of the excess runoff from failing septic systems or not very good performing septic systems or cesspits, or people going in that barely used any water 50 years ago, things have changed, they use a lot more water. They're storing these areas around the water bodies just to cut down on the damage being done. Merrimack, New Hampshire, Merrimack, Mass. Just I think about those two right off the top of my head, both receiving waters. They're getting rid of the on-site and they're putting sewers in. And basically that's what they did around Lake Winnipesaukee with the Winnipesaukee Basin Project, put a sewer in. Allowed for more development, more year-round homes, but they also put in the land use so people weren't, the shoreline protection. Anything else? All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.